You hire a financial planner, you max your 401k, you do everything right, and somewhere around $1 million in net worth, you call me and say you can't sleep. Not because you're broke, because the number is never enough to feel like enough. There's a man earning $140,000 a year who checks his bank account at 2 in the morning like it's gonna tell him something different from last time. And there's a guy I know running a plumbing supply company, clearing $68,000 a year, who hit $100,000 in a brokerage account last spring and told me without any dramatics that he feels richer than he ever has in his life. Same country, roughly similar incomes, completely different internal experience of money. And the difference is not what anyone is measuring. In 2024, Northwestern Mutual surveyed American millionaires, actual millionaires, people with at least $1 million in investable assets, and asked them a simple question: do you feel wealthy? Just 32% said yes. 32. 2/3 of millionaires do not feel wealthy. That is not a rounding error. That is a structural feature of how human beings interact with money. And if you don't understand it, you will spend your life running a race where the finish line moves every time you get close. Today, I'm gonna give you 3 specific net worth thresholds, not income, net worth anchored in Federal Reserve data, peer-reviewed psychology research, and over a decade of watching how money actually moves through real people's lives. At each of these 3 levels, something specific and mechanical changes, not a vibe, a structure. And understanding the structure is what separates people who build wealth with intentionality from people who accumulate more and feel worse. Here's the metaphor I want you to hold on to for everything that follows, because I'm going to return to it repeatedly, and it's going to land differently each time. Think of net worth as your relationship with gravity. Below a certain threshold, financial gravity is working against you. Every unexpected expense, every market dip, every layoff, every medical bill falls on you and drains energy and progress. But above specific thresholds, not at random, but at very particular numbers, the physics change. Gravity reverses. The same force that was destroying you starts accumulating things toward you. Your money generates more money. Your decisions have different quality. The game changes rules. That's it. 3 thresholds, 3 gravity shifts. And almost nobody tells you where they actually are. There are roughly 62% of American adults living paycheck to paycheck right now, according to a 2025 Lending Club and PYMNTS study. And here's the number that ends careers when I drop it in conversation. 44% of people earning over $100,000 a year are also living paycheck to paycheck. More than 4 in 10 people making 6 figures have essentially no financial mass, no gravity buffer, which means the variable is not income. The variable is accumulated net worth. And almost nobody is having that conversation seriously. Let me tell you where the first gravity shift actually happens. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you something about the second threshold that is genuinely disturbing, and I mean that clinically, not for drama. But first, let's establish the number that actually changes the mechanics of daily life for most people, and why almost all financial content rushes past it in its excitement to talk about millionaires and early retirement. The first threshold is $100,000 in net worth, specifically in investable assets, not home equity, not your car, liquid compounding capital. I want to tell you about a woman. She's not famous. She works in purchasing for a mid-sized distribution company in Phoenix. For 6 years, she pulled in between $45,000 and $58,000 per year. She was not aggressive about investing. She was not a finance person. She contributed to her 401k steadily, not maxed, just consistent, and put whatever was left into a brokerage account every month, usually between $300 and $500. And somewhere in the spring of 2023, she crossed $100,000 in investable assets. She told me what changed. And it wasn't what you'd expect from watching personal finance content. She didn't go out and celebrate. She didn't feel rich. She felt quiet. She said she stopped doing the mental math in the grocery store. She stopped checking her account balance before every small purchase. She said, "It's like I stopped bracing for impact all the time." That's a really specific description of something real. And if you've ever lived below that threshold, You know exactly what she's describing, even if you've never heard it articulated that way. Here's what's happening mechanically. Before $100,000 in invested assets, almost 100% of your financial progress comes from what you personally put in. You are the engine. Your savings rate is doing all the work. The money itself is not yet heavy enough to move meaningfully on its own. At $100,000 invested at an 8% average annual return, which is historically close to the long-run S&P 500 average, you generate $8,000 per year without lifting a finger. $8,000. That is not symbolic. That is real money that can cover your car insurance, your phone bill, your groceries for a few months. It is your first hired employee who never takes a sick day. And contrast that to $10,000 invested at the same rate that generates $800 a year. Noticeable on a spreadsheet. Irrelevant in your daily life. Growing your money from $0 to $100,000. Investing $10,000 annually at a 7% annual return takes about 7.84 years. But getting from $100,000 to $200,000 at the same contribution rate takes only 5.1 years, 35% faster. And the next 100,000 comes even faster. The snowball is not a metaphor. It is a literal mathematical acceleration that does not become visible to most people until they have enough mass to feel it. Charlie Munger, Berkshire Hathaway's vice chairman for over 5 decades, the man who spent 60 years sitting across the desk from Warren Buffett, said publicly that the first $100,000 is ABCH. But you got to do it. And after that, you can ease off the gas a little bit. A man with billions. The single piece of advice he gave young people building wealth. Get to 100,000 first, not 1 million, 100,000. And the Federal Reserve's own survey data from the 2022 Survey of Consumer Finances, the most recent comprehensive snapshot we have. With a new survey underway and results expected in late 2026, it found that 37% of Americans could not cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing or selling something. That is not income poverty. That is buffer poverty, zero mass. Any small rock that falls lands all the way through, and the experience of living in that state is profoundly different from every other level of financial life, not because of what you can or cannot buy, but because your nervous system never, ever fully relaxes. You are always bracing. The psychology research tells a similar story. The 2023 adversarial collaboration between Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, University of Pennsylvania senior fellow Matthew Killingsworth, and Professor Barbara Mellers, which resolved their long-standing academic disagreement about whether happiness rises with income indefinitely or plateaus, found a nuanced result. On average, larger incomes are associated with ever-increasing levels of happiness. But zoom in, and the relationship becomes more complex. Among the unhappy cohort in each income group, happiness rises sharply up to $100,000 annually and then plateaus. What that means in plain language, more money can keep buying peace of mind for people who are already psychologically functional. But for people carrying real misery, clinical depression, grief, relational devastation, the money stops helping past a threshold. The floor is the floor. And the $100,000 net worth mark is roughly where that floor gets stable enough to stand on. That is what I call the first gravity shift. Not wealth, not freedom, escape. You have enough mass that the system can no longer crush you with every small setback, and that is a completely different life. Stay with me, because the second threshold is where things get genuinely strange. And I want to be specific about how strange, because this is the part that most financial content completely fumbles. The second threshold is $1 million. And I want to use the Northwestern Mutual data again, because it's the sharpest way to tell this particular story. Just 1/3, 32% of American millionaires consider themselves wealthy, and nearly half, 48%, believe that their financial plans need improvement. Think about that number seriously for a moment. These are not people who stumbled into $1 million through luck. These are people who, in many cases, accumulated that amount over decades of deliberate saving and investing. And 2/3 of them don't feel like they're there yet. This is what I call the false summit problem. You're climbing for years, you stay disciplined, you sacrifice, You resist lifestyle inflation sometimes, and when you finally crest the ridge, there's another mountain. Let me tell you about a man I'll call Marcus. He spent 26 years in pharmaceutical sales. He maxed his 401k every year from age 28. He diversified. He stayed the course during crashes. He avoided the major financial disasters that take people off the path. By his 51st birthday, his household net worth, home equity included, was $1.1 million. He had cleared the milestone that every financial calculator in America treats as the proxy for success. And Marcus told me, I feel like I'm one bad year away from losing it. And here's the thing, he's not wrong. He's also not in actual danger. But his experience of money at $1.1 million was barely different from his experience at $500,000. The anxiety had followed him upward, same cortisol, different account balance. Here's why. $1 million invested at a 4% withdrawal rate, the number still used by most mainstream retirement planners, though I'll come back to why that number has serious problems, generates $40,000 per year. $40,000 per year is below the median household income in America. The median net worth of all Americans in 2022 was $192,900. So $1 million puts you in a completely different stratosphere. But the income that million generates in retirement is not a comfortable lifestyle for most people in most cities in this country. It is survival with some dignity. And if you're in Boston, San Francisco, or New York, it might not even be that. By the way, hit subscribe if you like the content. Otherwise, YouTube's algorithm may never show you my videos again. The threshold for feeling financially comfortable has dropped to around $778,000, down from $1 million the previous year, suggesting a shift toward valuing security over extravagance. And separately, per Bankrate's 2025 Financial Freedom Survey, the threshold Americans report for feeling wealthy, not comfortable, wealthy, has risen to $2.5 million, up 14% from $2.2 million in 2023, driven by inflation and rising costs. So the psychological map of American wealth, as of right now, in early 2026, looks like this. Below $100,000 in net worth. Danger zone, no buffer, financial bracing at all times. Between $100,000 and $778,000. Getting somewhere, but still fundamentally dependent on income. At approximately $778,000, you feel comfortable. At $2.5 million, you feel wealthy. And at $11.6 million in net worth. Based on Federal Reserve data and independent analysis, you enter the top 1%. The distance between comfortable and wealthy in America is roughly $1.7 million. The distance between wealthy and top 1% is $9 million above that. And here's what I want you to do with that information. I don't want you to feel crushed by it. I want you to understand that this is an internal experience problem more than it is a math problem. Because here's where the narrative flips. You think the problem at the $1 million level is that the number is too low, that you need more, that you have to keep accumulating before anything changes. Actually, the problem is that you're measuring the wrong thing. $1 million structurally at a 7% annual return generates $70,000 per year. That is not small money. From 2019 to 2022, the median U.S. household net worth rose 37% in inflation-adjusted terms, the largest jump since the modern survey began in 1989. In real terms, the median climbed from roughly $120,000 in 2016 to $193,000 in 2022, which means the gap between where most people are and where $1 million sits is real. But the gap between what $1 million actually generates and what people think it should generate is also real. And it's a denominator problem, disguised as a numerator problem. I'll come back to this in a few minutes because it's the deepest structural insight in this entire video. Here's what's happening between thresholds 1 and 2 that nobody maps correctly. The accumulation zone, roughly $100,000 to $1 million, is where compound interest has shifted from background noise to meaningful co-contributor. In the beginning, almost all your progress comes from what you contribute. Once you hit $100,000, the returns from your investments start making a real impact. Eventually, your portfolio can grow more in a year than you're putting in yourself. That's when momentum kicks in. But in this zone, you are still fundamentally dependent on your income. Your portfolio is helping, but you need the paycheck. The engine is on, but you still need your foot on the gas. This zone is also where lifestyle inflation does its most quiet and destructive work. America's top earners feel just as broke as workers scraping by on less than $50,000, thanks to soaring food, housing, and luxury item costs. Workers earning over $500,000 annually are living paycheck to paycheck. The mechanism is identical at every income level. Spending rises to absorb income, which means net worth grows only as fast as the delta between what you earn and what you spend. And for most Americans, that delta is smaller than it looks. This is the gravity situation in the accumulation zone. Gravity is not fully against you anymore, but it's not with you yet. You're in a transition state. Progress is real, freedom is not. Here's what changes at the third threshold. And I want you to stay here with me because this is the number that the financial industry treats as aspirational, but that actually has a specific, verifiable, structural definition. The threshold to be in the top 10% of US households by net worth grew from about 1.3 million to roughly $1.8 million over the last 5 years, largely due to rising stock and home values. That figure comes from a Visa analysis of 2024 US Census Bureau survey data reported in late 2025. Nationally, those thresholds are about $210,000 a year in income, or a net worth of roughly $1.8 million. Now here's what $1.8 million in net worth actually buys you that $1 million does not. And I want to be precise about this because this is the operational definition of what I mean by the gravity flip. At $1 million invested, at a 7% annual return, you generate $70,000 per year. That is meaningful. But in most scenarios, it is not enough to fully replace a professional income and sustain the life you've built. At $1.8 million at the same return, you generate $126,000 per year. That is a different conversation. That is, for the vast majority of people watching this, full financial independence. Not theoretical independence, operational independence. The kind where your Tuesday morning decision about whether to continue your current work is made based on preference, not paycheck. That is optionality. And optionality is not a feeling. Optionality is a decision structure. It changes the negotiation you have with your employer, with your clients, with your own choices. When your livelihood is not conditional on any single relationship, your decisions become genuinely free, not in theory, but in practice. Every conversation you have with someone who has authority over your income becomes different when you could walk away and be fine. Wealth gains have been more concentrated in high income and high net worth households than among others. In 2025, the top 20% of income earners accounted for 80.1% of total growth in wealth. And that share has gone up in the last 3 years. This is the compounding of the gravity flip. Once you're in the top 10% by net worth, rising markets pull you further ahead, not through your effort, but through your mass. The physics have permanently changed. And the spending data is the clearest expression of what this actually feels like. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, citing Moody's analytics data, found that spending by the top 10% grew 62% between the third quarter of 2020 and the third quarter of 2025, much more than any other income group. Compare that to roughly 3% for everyone else. That's not a different lifestyle. That's a different operating reality. And it's driven almost entirely by asset appreciation, stocks, real estate, private equity, which is available only to those who've accumulated enough mass to own meaningful portions of those asset classes. So the standard advice, max your 401k, diversify, and stay the course, is technically accurate and nearly useless in isolation. It's like telling someone who asked how to run a marathon to put one foot in front of the other. The mechanics are correct, the map is missing. Now, here's the fourth and final thing. The thing that ties all three thresholds together. And I want to be direct about this because it is the most counterintuitive insight in all of personal finance. And it's the one that changes the timeline for everything else. You think the problem is the numerator. It's actually the denominator. Let me tell you about a friend I'll call Daniel. He built a software consulting business over 8 years. By year 6, he was clearing around $200,000 per year after taxes and expenses. He had accumulated a net worth of about $900,000, nearly all of it in a brokerage account. And his 401k, objectively, he was in the top 20 to 25% of American households by net worth. He was in the accumulation zone, close to the second threshold. But Daniel was miserable, not financially, existentially. He had done the math, or thought he had, and concluded he needed 1.5, maybe 2 million before he could step away from the consulting grind. And his savings rate, despite earning $200,000 a year, was not what you'd expect. His lifestyle had grown alongside his income in ways that felt completely reasonable individually. A house upgrade in his early 40s, private school for 2 kids, a car that matched where he imagined himself to be in life. None of it profligate, all of it freedom destroying. Daniel and I sat down and ran the actual numbers. Here's what we found. His actual necessary annual spending, if he made every expense a deliberate choice rather than a default, was around $80,000, not the $120,000 he was currently spending. The $40,000 difference applied to the denominator of his freedom calculation was transformative. At a 4% withdrawal rate, each $1 of annual spending requires $25 in accumulated portfolio assets to sustain in perpetuity. That's just the math. 1 divided by 0.04 equals 25. So $40,000 per year of unnecessary spending that he had drifted into rather than chosen, required $1 million more in portfolio assets before he could be free. $1 million. Not because he needed more income, because his denominator was wrong. When Daniel corrected his denominator, reduced it to $80,000 a year by eliminating the spending categories that brought him the least satisfaction per dollar, which took him one honest afternoon to identify his number, dropped from $1.5 million to $2 million, down to exactly $2 million, and then further to something closer to $1.9 million at a slightly more conservative withdrawal rate, which meant he was, by his own revised math, already at the threshold of optionality. He had been free for over a year and didn't know it because he was carrying a denominator problem and calling it a numerator problem. This is the deepest structural insight I have after a decade of running businesses, sitting with accountants and fiscal lawyers who taught me how money actually moves, and watching people at every level of wealth make the same category of error. Almost nobody optimizes the denominator. Almost everybody adds to the numerator. And the gravity does not flip, not at 100,000, not at 1 million, not at 1.8 million, until you know specifically what your freedom number is and can verify that your portfolio has crossed it. And here is the number that makes this concrete. At a 7% annual return, $1.8 million in net worth, compounding without any withdrawals, becomes $3.5 million in 10 years, without adding a single additional dollar. If you're still working and contributing while that compounds, you can reach top 5% territory, roughly $2.5 million to $3 million in net worth inside a decade from the 1 million mark. Not as a fantasy, as basic math that most people never run because they're too distracted trying to earn their way to a number they've never actually defined. Here's what the 3 thresholds look like when you tie them to the denominator framework. The first $100,000 is the escape from financial bracing, the point where the buffer exists and the nervous system can, for the first time, occasionally stand down. The second $1 million is the point where the engine is fully running, where compound interest is a genuine co-contributor, but where the freedom calculation depends entirely on what your life costs. The third 1.8 million, or whatever number generates your actual necessary annual spending at a reasonable withdrawal rate, is where the physics change permanently, where optionality is no longer theoretical. But none of it arrives automatically at the threshold. You have to consciously define what you need, specifically before you reach it. Not after. Not when I get there, I'll figure it out. Before. Because the people I've watched cross each of these thresholds without having done that work, go right through them without feeling the shift. The finish line moved again, and they're still running. Let me make this real with specific numbers. Take a 43-year-old man, I'll call him Ryan, earning $120,000 per year. He has been contributing to his 401k for 15 years, has a brokerage account, and has home equity with roughly $200,000 remaining on his mortgage. His combined investable net worth is $480,000. He feels behind. He's not. At $480,000 invested at an 8% return, Ryan's portfolio is generating $38,400 per year right now, silently, without Ryan doing anything other than not selling. If Ryan adds $24,000 per year in new contributions, an aggressive but achievable savings rate on his income, and earns 7% annually over the next 6 years, he reaches $1 million at age 49. At 49, with a largely paid off home and $1 million in investable assets generating $60,000 to $70,000 per year, Ryan's situation looks completely different from where he stands today. Not because the number's magic, because the denominator can match. If Ryan's life costs $65,000 a year intentionally, not accidentally, he has crossed the optionality threshold before ever reaching $1.8 million in raw net worth. Because the gravity flip is not triggered by a specific number. It's triggered by the relationship between what your portfolio generates and what your life requires. The number is just the vehicle. But if Ryan does nothing deliberate about his spending, if he lets lifestyle absorb his raises the way Bank of America found, about 19% of higher income households have done, where lifestyle creep is the main driver of paycheck to paycheck living at 6-figure incomes, he may reach $1.8 million in net worth at 56 or 58, feeling rushed, feeling late, wondering why it still doesn't feel like enough. The anxiety followed him all the way up because the denominator was never addressed. Here are 3 specific, non-generic things to do with this framework. First, treat your first $100,000 in investable assets as a completely separate mission from everything else in your financial life. Not $100,000 in home equity, not your car value, liquid, working, compounding capital in a brokerage or retirement account. This is your escape from financial gravity. It deserves its own timeline, its own focused energy, its own discipline. No car upgrade, no lifestyle creep, no rationalized exception that sounds reasonable and costs you 2 years. Get here first. Nothing else in your financial life compounds meaningfully until you do. Second, once you're in the accumulation zone, between $100,000 and $1 million, every dollar of permanent spending increase you commit to raises the portfolio you need by $25. $1,000 per month of unnecessary spending, a car upgrade, a restaurant habit that crept in, a streaming subscription multiplied by several requires $25,000 more in your portfolio just to sustain that spending in perpetuity. Track this number. It is the most important number in your financial life at this stage. Not your income, not your investment returns. The ratio between your necessary spending and your accumulated assets, that ratio tells you where you are relative to every threshold, far more accurately than any account balance alone. Third, define your actual freedom number before you reach any of the 3 thresholds. What does your life cost? Intentionally, not accidentally. What is your annual spending when every expense is a conscious choice rather than a default that accumulated over years of income matching? Run that number. Multiply it by 25 for a 4% withdrawal rate, or by 33 for a 3% rate. If you're retiring early and need the portfolio to survive a longer window, that calculation produces your specific number. Not a million, not 2 million, your number, the number that when your portfolio clears it with a reasonable withdrawal strategy and a sound buffer means the physics have changed. You can choose to keep working. You can choose not to. And that choice, that specific structural freedom, is the actual finish line. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes. And the interesting thing is, the people who figured that out earliest usually spent less time staring at charts and more time doing boring math about what their life actually costs, which is not exciting. But neither's working until 68 because you kept moving the number. The percentage of Americans who believe they will never achieve financial security has risen from 26% in 2023 to 30% in 2024. Most of them are not chasing the wrong number because they're lazy. They're chasing the wrong number because nobody handed them the map. Now you have